Good day. The last 24 hours have seen attempts by the Jihadi forces currently in control of Syria to try to get control of the situation, and comments from President Erdogan of Turkey, all of which appear to point in the same direction. I get the sense that in Erdogan's case, he's starting to understand the extent to which he may have overreached, and that the processes that are now unleashed in Syria point towards fragmentation and chaos rather than the stable control over the country by his proxies that he might have perhaps anticipated or hoped for. He's been making, in particular, repeated statements about how Turkey wants Syria to preserve itself, that he backs and that Turkey continues to back Syria's full territorial integrity. In other words, he wants the Kurdish areas brought back under the control of the Syrian government in Damascus. And I suspect he's also alarmed, as many people in the region are, by the ongoing Israeli advance ever deeper into Syria, which I will discuss shortly. The jihadis, in the meantime, are busy setting up what they say is a new interim government, which is supposed to govern Syria for 3 months. I'm not sure what they expect will happen once those 3 months have passed. But anyway, they're talking about this, and they have also appointed a official who they say will lead that interim government over the next oncoming period. Now, this individual, Mohammed al-Bashir, is in fact a person who has been long associated with the Jihadi fighters. He was based with them in Idlib, and I think he's fairly well known to the Russians and to others, very much as somebody who is not only very much in tune with the Jihadis' thinking, but also in tune with the thinking of President Erdogan. And the new government is apparently called the Syrian Salvation Government, which I have to say is also the sort of name that one tends to associate with the political bodies that jihadi fighters set up as soon as they gain control of a particular country. And there have been reports that jihadi leaders have been speaking to leaders of the Christian communities in Aleppo and other places, trying to reassure them that no threat or attack is intended against them, and trying to persuade them, presumably, to remain part of the new Syria that they wish to create. Now, I don't want to say that all of these reassurances, all of these comments that are being made by Erdogan and by the Syrian jihadi leaders are entirely insincere. Some of these leaders may indeed want to stabilize Syria, to establish a new government there. But in my experience, and again, it's based on what has happened before in other countries which have gone through a similar regime change process, once the forces of chaos are set in motion, it becomes almost impossible to bring them under control. A Syrian Salvation Government is most unlikely to have much authority on the streets of any Syrian city. The control in those places will have passed to the men with the guns. They will be taking instructions from whatever local warlord is dominant in the particular area, and that warlord in turn may or may not accept the nominal authority of the Syrian Salvation Government, but he probably feels that one way or the other, that government is remote from him and has little ability to control locally what he does. And I should say that the jihadi fighters have also been doing something else, which I suspect is only going to add to the chaos, which is that in every city that they have captured, as they have captured it, including Damascus and Aleppo and Homs and other places, they have immediately released people from the prisons. The prisons have been emptied right across Syria. Now, many of the people who were held in those prisons were no doubt political opponents of President Assad and of his government. Several of them, many of them, may have been jihadi fighters themselves. People, in other words, who were part of the movement that has now taken control of Syria. One should by no means discount this as a factor, but not all of them will be. Some of them will simply be straightforward criminals. Some of them will be violent and dangerous criminals. It doesn't seem as if any attempt has been made to really work out who amongst the prisoners should be released and who should continue to be detained. In the chaos, they have all been released. So that means that violent criminal elements have been allowed to escape into Syria, and that inevitably is going to add to the chaos and to the confusion. The Syrian central bank is said to be still functioning and still trying to regulate the currency. Around the world, Syrian embassies continue to function. They've changed flags from the flag of the secular Syrian Arab Republic that President Assad used to lead to the new entity. I am not sure exactly what its name is. And I understand that Syrian diplomats continue to serve in these embassies, the same people that were appointed by the Assad government, and they continue to the best extent that they can, from what I can see, to serve Syria. I should say that the Syrian diplomatic corps had achieved widespread respect across the Middle East and much of the world for its high quality and its loyalty during the war to President Assad's government. There were astonishingly few defections from amongst them, and one senses that they continue to loyally serve Syria, and they've been sending letters, apparently without any clear instructions from Damascus, to the UN authorities, complaining about the ongoing Israeli advance into Syria. But, of course, we come back to that point, that there is no genuine, true, functioning government in Damascus. Elements of the bureaucracy, the central bank, and the diplomatic service may still be functioning, but it's clear that the military has disintegrated entirely and to all intents and purposes no longer exists. And the same must be true of the rest of the state bureaucracy, the administrative apparatus that once upon a time held together the entire country. And that, of course, includes the education system and everything else. So, given this complete collapse of Syrian state institutions that we are now seeing take place, a collapse which is incomplete, but which I suspect will gradually acquire ever greater momentum. Well, I suspect that, as I said, the processes of chaos are going to be all but impossible to withstand or resist as they continue to gain force. So there we are. Now, I've been reading the Western media very carefully over the last couple of days, amidst the triumphalism that you do find amongst some people. There does also appear to be some elements of confusion and concern and even alarm. It has been noticed that the people who are now in control of Syria, or who claim to be in control of Syria, and who are now forming Syria's new government, are various jihadi leaders and movements, some of which are prescribed in the West and are classified as terrorist organizations. And amidst the, as I said, triumphalism, one can sense the doubts. In fact, there's even been a rather interesting article, I think it was by Gideon Rachman, in the Financial Times, saying that the fact that these doubts exist should in no way mean that we should have second thoughts in the West about the wisdom of our previous opposition to President Assad and of his government, and of our desire to see his fall. So it's almost as if, in effect, Mr. Rachman is if it was him who wrote that article, is now addressing what many people perhaps are privately thinking, and some people are privately saying, which is perhaps that the collapse of Syria was not in the end such a good idea after all. We've seen this game play out in Iraq, in Libya, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, and now it's Syria's turn. So anyway, all of this is happening. There's also reports of increasingly fierce fighting between Turkish-backed jihadi fighters and the Kurds in Manbij. There are some reports that the Turkish government is also considering a broader intervention in Syria. President Erdogan has been going out of his way to say that though he supports Syria and its territorial integrity, he will never allow terrorist forces to establish themselves there, despite the fact that the country is now largely controlled by many different groups, Kurdish, Arab, Turkmen, whatever, all of which, perhaps, have at various times been classified by various people as terrorist forces. As I said, it seems to me that in Erdogan's case, he may find that having sown the storm in Syria, he has unleashed the whirlwind. And I've read a fascinating article in the Daily Telegraph about the prospects of a massive refugee flood from Syria. Western governments, perhaps European governments, I should say, perhaps now increasingly alarmed by the processes that they are starting to see play out in Syria, are starting to reject, apparently, asylum applications from Syrian refugees. I have been told anecdotally by lots of people that there is actually no particular desire on the part of Syrian refugees or asylum seekers or immigrants or migrants, whatever you want to call them, in Europe to return to Syria at this time. And why would they want to return given the situation there? Anyway, I read an article in the Daily Telegraph. I'm not going to read it, but it's by Guy Dampier, and the title, in effect, says it all. Taking Syrian refugees nearly destroyed Europe. We cannot withstand another wave. But another wave might indeed be what is going to come. Because when a crisis like this happens, especially if it starts to spread beyond Syria itself, to Iraq, to Jordan, possibly to Egypt, then of course it may be very difficult to withstand the wave, whatever defences, whatever barriers are put up. Overstretched and bankrupt governments right across Europe might find that a difficult challenge. Anyway, there we are. That seems to me the situation in Syria as of this particular point in time. The big specific story that is playing out in Syria at the moment is of the continued advance of the Israeli army deep into Syria. By some reports, they are now just 20 kilometers from Damascus itself. There are also reports that the Israelis are continuing their bombing strikes right across Syria, trying to destroy the military installations of the now collapsed Syrian government, presumably to prevent them falling under jihadi control or under the control of jihadi groups that might potentially one day become hostile to Israel. And again, in Israel, I sense also that same mixture of triumphalism, particularly heady in Israel at the moment, mixed with some concern. On the one hand, Israel is now in occupation of vast stretches of territory. It has taken control of the entire Golan Heights. Prime Minister Netanyahu has made comments confirming what I've always said, that Israel will never give up the entire territory of the Golan Heights, which it now controls, even though legally, but according to international law, the Golan Heights are unequivocally Syrian territory. But of course, the Israelis have pushed well beyond the Golan Heights. Apparently, they are now advancing to positions which could potentially allow them to outflank Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon. And apparently there are large, rich agricultural lands in southern Syria which could conceivably fall under their control, and which some people in Israel, including the finance minister, Mr. Smotrich, are now talking about Israel taking under control and occupying, and perhaps occupying with Israeli settlements. In other words, a further expansion of the territory that Israel has acquired in the Middle East. And there are also reminders, apparently from some Israeli hardliners, perhaps Mr. Smotrich, that the envisaged greater Israel that some Israelis have been talking about for many years, in fact, which some of the original settlers imagined even before the State of Israel was established, that greater Israel could extend to Damascus itself, that Damascus itself might become a part of it. Now, here I'm going to express my own personal view. Just as Turkey is now disastrously overcommitted to a Syria that is showing clear signs of spinning out of control, Israel actually also risks a very dangerous degree of overextension. It is in the process of acquiring more land, which is internationally recognized as Arab land. Well, they're not particularly bothered by that, I suspect. But they might also find that by doing so, they're bringing under their control many, many more Arabs. Now, I would have thought that by this point, with the problems that Israel has been facing in Gaza and in the West Bank, it ought to be obvious that it is very difficult for Israel to govern, to control large numbers of people of Arabic nationality and Islamic religion who ultimately reject its authority. But it looks as if there are some people in Israel who want it to do just that. Now, there is a view, a widespread view, promoted by some members of the Jihadi forces that have now taken control of Syria, that the jihadis have no particular desire to fight Israel, that on the contrary, they see Israel as an ally, that they've accepted help and assistance from Israel. And up to a certain point, I think that might be true. But I doubt that that is the sentiment of most of the fighters. And sooner or later, in an atmosphere of chaos and confusion, we could find that forces start to emerge in Syria, radical jihadi forces, deeply hostile to Israel itself, willing to wage war against it, and to do so in ways that no secular Arab army has done up to this time. Now, I say that it's perhaps worth bearing in mind that many of the people who've gained control in Syria have very similar ideological positions to Hamas in Gaza. And in fact, Hamas has now issued a statement welcoming the victory of the jihadi forces in Syria. And at least some jihadi fighters are now apparently already putting out banners speaking about onward to Jerusalem. So, again, for the moment, the Israelis are acquiring more territory. They're meeting no resistance. The Arab states are wringing their hands and complaining about it, but there isn't very much they can do. The Syrian diplomatic service that still functions after a fashion, one wonders who is paying their salaries, continues to send desperate letters complaining about what is happening to the United Nations. So for the moment, the Israelis have the initiative. But will that still be true in 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10? Could it be that, just as Israel has found, that advances into southern Lebanon, into Gaza, even into the West Bank, have brought massive problems upon Israel, leading to the events of the 7th of October of last year and to the enormous pressures that Israel has experienced ever since, that advances into Syria are simply going to end up giving Israel many, many more problems that it can't ultimately cope with. Well, there we are. Now, let's look at the two other powers that have been so heavily involved in the Syrian conflict. Let's turn first to Iran. Now, the Iranians are clearly in very profound and deep shock. One can sense deep recriminations within Iran about what has taken place. Apparently there is a major blame game underway, though it's difficult to know the details of it, and I'm not going to try and unpick the details. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I spoke on this channel about certain statements that had been made by Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and which were backed by some other Iranian officials and former Iranian officials who basically floated the possibility of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. And shortly after, about a couple of weeks after, other Iranian officials, people closer to President Pezeshkian, who continues to try desperately to re-establish some kind of dialogue with the West. They then contradicted these statements and said explicitly that Iran has no plan for the moment to acquire nuclear weapons. And I've suggested that this is all very much part of an argument that has been going on within Iran ever since the crisis began, the current crisis began in the Middle East on the 7th of October, with advocates of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons gradually gaining ground, and Ayatollah Khamenei looking as if he might at some point decide to change his stance on this issue. Now, I have to say, I think the events in Syria are probably going to tilt the balance of this argument further in favour of those who do feel that security for Iran can only be achieved if Iran becomes, like North Korea, a full nuclear weapons state. I don't think any decision has yet been made, but I would not be surprised if that is what we see happen. Anyway, in the meantime, there is deep worry and concern in Iran, but the Iranians are still there. They're waiting to see what Donald Trump is going to do, and in the meantime, they are talking about the importance of deepening their ties with China and Russia. Now, here we have to come back to the Russians, because this is now becoming a very complex and interesting issue. The Russians continue to be very, very quiet in discussing what is happening in Syria. President Putin has still made no public comment about this. The only public comments have come so far from the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, and he too has fallen silent. I have, however, had a significant amount of information which I consider to be completely reliable from someone close to the Wagner organization. I can actually confirm that this person is indeed close to the Wagner organization. And he has described to me a lot of what took place in Syria before President Assad's fall and the chaos and confusion of those weeks as the Russians saw it. Specifically, this person says that when news started to filter through that a jihadi offensive was about to be launched in Idlib province, the Russians were determined to resist it, to help the Syrians resist it. There have been some stories circulating in alternative media and independent media, and I believe very widely in the Middle East, that the events of the last couple of weeks are the product of some kind of deal done between Putin and Erdogan, that in return for Erdogan's backing over the crisis in Ukraine, Putin agreed to sacrifice Assad and Syria. I have to say straight away that I see no evidence of this, and I don't believe this to be the case at all. And this information which I've received suggests clearly that this information, these claims, these reports are wrong. There was no deal done between Putin and Erdogan, and no expectation or plan on the part of the Russians that Assad would be ousted from power at any point over the last couple of weeks. Anyway, these sources have provided me with what I think is the correct information about the size of the jihadi forces that were committed to the battle in the first couple of days after when the conflict began. The core force was a force of around 5,000 fighters who entered Syria from Turkey. It's claimed by the Wagner men on the ground that around 1,500 of these 5,000 fighters were actually special forces trained in Turkey itself. Some of them may have been Turks, others may have been people who have been recruited by the Turkish special services and trained and incorporated into their special forces. But anyway, they were part of a unit in effect under Turkish control. And this was the core force. Now, there were various other fighters who came together to make up the larger force that began to advance on Aleppo. And the other fighters, the various different groups, jihadi groups in Idlib province who joined this cadre, if you like, they appear to have numbered between 20 and 25,000. Now that brings us to a number of around 25 to 30,000 in the total, in the overall force that began the advance on Aleppo. Now, I understand that Alistair Crook has revised upwards his estimate of the jihadi forces that attacked Aleppo. He now puts them at around 30,000, which corresponds almost exactly with this figure I've heard from, as I said, this source who is close to Wagner. So, at the time when this operation began, there were around 2,500 Wagner troops in Syria, most of them involved in training. A force of them was sent to Aleppo in order to help the Syrian army defend Aleppo. They arrived there. They discovered that there had been significant infiltration of Aleppo by jihadi cells, which caused a great deal of confusion. But it would have been possible to establish a stable defense line, except that completely unexpectedly, a decision was made by the Syrian general in charge of Aleppo to order the entire garrison of Aleppo to retreat from the city. And this left the Wagner forces in Aleppo completely isolated, without any Syrian troops in Aleppo to support them. In the meantime, another force of Wagner troops were being sent to Aleppo, presumably from Khmeimim, in order to initially reinforce the Wagner troops who had previously been sent to Aleppo. On their way, they saw the Syrian army, the Syrian soldiers fleeing from Aleppo. The great majority of them had laid down their weapons, were pouring down the road without any weapons. Some of them, apparently, some Syrian troops, to the shock and disgust of the Wagner fighters, exited their tanks and armoured vehicles and abandoned them on the road as they fled south. And in fact, there are lots of pictures. There were lots of pictures earlier in the battle showing how this had happened, how large numbers of armoured vehicles littering the road to Aleppo, abandoned by the Syrian soldiers who had been operating them, and left intact to be captured by the jihadi fighters. Nonetheless, the Wagner relief force advanced to Aleppo. They joined up with the Wagner forces there, and they were all able to withdraw, ultimately to Damascus with minimal losses. Apparently, there was no serious attempt made by the jihadi fighters at any time to engage them. Anyway, when they did arrive in Damascus, it was apparently still the intention to resist, at least on the Russian side. Reinforcements continued to be sent to Syria from Russia, and there were even reports that a reserve airborne brigade was being prepared for urgent dispatch to Syria from Russia. But what then happened is that various Syrian generals in Homs, in Damascus, and elsewhere, again, without informing or consulting the Russians, simply ordered their men to put down their arms and to give up the fight. And this was what eventually led to the collapse, and a decision was taken, ultimately from Moscow, that all Wagner forces, all Russian forces from right across Syria should withdraw to the Russian bases in Khmeimim and Tartus, and should consolidate there. And Russian forces continue to drive towards these bases from locations right across Syria, even from the Kurdish regions in the Far East, in the eastern parts of Syria. And I've seen pictures of these convoys of Russian troops moving towards the bases the Russian bases on the Mediterranean coast. And again, no one seems to be interfering with them or resisting them. There seems to have been a collective decision not to tangle with the Russians. So that is the story that I've heard about what happened on the Russian side of this whole debacle. The jihadi leadership, for the moment, are going out of their way to say that they want good relations with Russia. They're seeking a long-term relationship with Moscow. There's even rumors that they want the Russians to help train their forces, their new army, which they presumably want to establish. And there's even some claims that they actually want the Russian bases to remain in Syria where they are. And HTS, the main jihadi force, the main militia force, it's been said, has never actually publicly objected to the presence of the Russian bases in Syria. Now, I have to say that a deal presumably brokered by Erdogan, the jihadi leadership, and Russia to preserve the Russian bases in Syria in the complex, intricate politics of the Middle East is not something which would astonish me. In the Middle East, more than almost anywhere else, there are no permanent friends and there are no permanent enemies. So I can see that there might be some internal logic for the new authorities in Syria to want to keep the Russians there. The two Russian bases do limit possible operations by other external powers. The jihadis may be working hand in glove with the Turks at the moment, but there's always a risk that they might fall out. The Russians might also act as a constraining force on Israel, though the Russians have gone out of their way repeatedly to say that they're not looking for a fight with Israel in Syria. They've been saying that consistently ever since 2015. So it's not, however, impossible that some kind of a deal may be done. But I don't think that anyone in Moscow expects it. And I think that many people who are writing and speculating that something like that will eventually happen are almost certainly engaging in wishful thinking. The other big question here is whether the Russians will want to stay. It's assumed that the two bases are a major strategic asset for the Russians. I've seen it written and said in many places that Khmeimim acts as a major staging point for the Russians to reach their friends in Africa, as if the Russians could not perfectly easily travel to Africa, send their forces to Africa in some other way. I have to say that my own sense is that the strong inclination at the moment in Moscow is to leave and to wash their hands, for the Russians to wash their hands of the whole affair, that the heavy investment that they made in Syria has come to nothing, that they've had another demonstration of how unpredictable politics in the Middle East is, that they have more important things to concern themselves with closer to home, and that Syria all along, and as has proved, was a malinvestment. And I personally think that irrespective of what the jihadis say and perhaps want, that will be the sentiment that prevails. In which case, I would expect the Russians to obviously continue to maintain their close relationship with Turkey and to try to support Iran, which remains crucial to them and far more important than Syria ever was. But I don't think that they will be involved so deeply in Syrian affairs anymore. And I suspect that in time they might start to rethink their relationship with some other Arab countries which might also seem vulnerable at some point to this kind of takeover, like Egypt, for example. Anyway, there we are. We will see how things play out. But certainly in Erdogan's case, I get the sense that, as I said, that he now realizes that things have gone further than he perhaps, that was perhaps desirable to him. And as for the Israelis, for the moment, they are clearly the winners. This has completely changed the geography, the political geography in the Middle East, whereas Israel just a month ago looked as if it had become trapped in intractable wars in Gaza and in South Lebanon. It now finds itself suddenly in a position of unexpected and extraordinary advantage. But Israeli leaders, if they are wise, and I increasingly doubt, by the way, that many of them are, could risk overextension, finding themselves controlling territory that is difficult to control, controlling more people who are hostile to them, and increasing the number of their actual adversaries. Anyway, that's where we are. Assad continues to be in Moscow. Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has again stiffly said that the Russians played no part in persuading him to resign. Again, I can't help but feel that there is some element of anger behind these statements. And there's even some reports that Assad is once again thinking of returning to his old work as an ophthalmologist and setting up some kind of a clinic in Moscow. Though I have to say, I find those reports extremely unreliable, to the point where I don't frankly take them very seriously. For the record, I think that Assad's primary concern at the moment, his overriding concern, other than his own regrets and those which I suspect he does have for his country, will be the health of his wife. Anyway, that's the situation that we see. As I said, chaos, gathering force in Syria. I doubt that there is anything very much that can slow it down. Well, that's one war that's, as I said, probably, I'm guessing, at its beginning rather than its end. The Syrian crisis, which began in 2011, has now taken a catastrophic plunge downward. And I personally think that we're going to see a crisis that is going to continue now for decades going forward, and which will become a major headache for all of the surrounding powers, and quite plausibly for the Europeans as well. But anyway, there is that other war, the war that is being fought in Ukraine, and here developments on the ground are rapidly accelerating. And we've had a statement from the head of Russia's intelligence agency, the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service, Sergei Naryshkin, and he projects huge confidence and optimism from the Russians about developments on the ground, as well as, by the way, a very hard line in advance of negotiations. And we've had a lengthy extract of what he said, which was said in an interview with Razvedchik, Scout magazine. It's a magazine in Russia. Anyway, this is what he said. The situation on the front lines is not in Kiev's favor. We hold the initiative in all areas and are close to achieving our goals. While the Ukrainian armed forces are on the verge of collapse and the Zelensky regime has lost its legitimacy along with the ability to make agreements. Now, notice the last point. The Russians do not believe that Zelensky is in any position to deliver peace, and that he is not legitimate, and they don't believe that there is really very much point or purpose in trying to negotiate with him. Anyway, Naryshkin then went on to say that all attempts to create instability in Russia have failed. The people understand that we are not fighting against the Kiev junta, but against the collective West, and our freedom and sovereignty are at stake in this confrontation. The West's strategic goal in Ukraine was perfectly clear: to impose a war of attrition on us in order to divide Russian society and create conditions for a color revolution. That said, they will fight until the last Ukrainian, and once there are no Ukrainians left, the Baltic nations, the East Europeans, and later the Germans will be forced to join the fight against the scary Russian bear. The globalist powers already have the technologies they need to brainwash common people and put pressure on local elites. And then He went on to say that a further escalation of tensions will not only fail to deplete our resources, which is what Washington and London are aiming for, will bring the West closer to its own defeat. Despite sanctions and the theft of our sovereign assets, the Russian economy is growing. Import substitution efforts continue at a high pace, particularly in technology sectors. New logistic routes are emerging, and our economic ties with non-Western countries, primarily in Greater Eurasia, are strengthening. So that's from Naryshkin. So he doesn't expect that the Ukrainians will negotiate. He doesn't think that the Zelensky government is capable of negotiating. He doesn't think that the Zelensky government has the legitimacy to conduct negotiations. But in terms of what is happening on the front lines, he feels that Russia is close to dealing Ukraine a final knockout blow. Now, that may come as a surprise to anybody looking at the map. Certainly, the Russians have advanced very considerably over the course of this year, as many reports, even in the Western media now, acknowledge. But it is still the case that the Russians only control around 20% of Ukrainian territory, and that, by the way, includes Crimea, which, for these calculations, which one often sees in the Western media, are included as Ukrainian territory. And though there have been rapid advances, it is still the case that the vast bulk of Ukrainian territory remains under Ukrainian control. But as many people, Brian Beletic in particular, Scott of Calibrated, and others have pointed out in program after program, video after video, from the Russian point of view, this has never been a war for territory. It has always been a war of attrition, of a war aimed at grinding the Ukrainian army down, crushing it to the point where viable resistance becomes impossible. And that surely is what Naryshkin means when he says that the Russians are close to achieving their goals. And here I am going to engage in a short summary of what is going on the front lines. First of all, it should be said that there have been multiple big Russian missile strikes over the last couple of days. I have found it impossible to keep track of the number of missile strikes that the Russians are undertaking, but it is clear that the Russians are continuing to deal heavy punishment from the sky right across Ukraine, and that the Ukrainians continue to suffer very, very heavy losses. So I'm going to focus instead specifically on the events in the main battle lines. And let's begin from the south with Velika Novosilka. The Ukrainians have made lots of claims over the course of the last week that they have recaptured the village of Novi Komar, that they have also recaptured the village of Razdonye, which lies to the northwest of Novi Komar, and that they have broken the siege of Velikaya Novosilka, which the Russians have been busy encircling, even as the Russians continue to capture more positions previously held by the Ukrainian army south of Velikaya Novosilka and west of Velikaya Novosilka, where important settlements like Makarivka, Starozhny and Niskuchny apparently are likely to fall under Russian control very soon. But anyway, the Ukrainians have been claiming that, at least in the north, in Razdolny and Novi Kumar, they've achieved some success. Except it doesn't seem as if they have. Again, it's difficult to know why the Ukrainians are providing us with what appears to be, this time, incorrect information. It could be that there have been intense encounter battles and that these two villages, Razdolny and Novi Kumar, have moved backwards and forwards between Russian and Ukrainian control. But the latest film clearly shows the Russians in secure control of Novi Kumar, and it's logical to believe that they control Razdolny also. So it looks as if the trap that the Russians have laid on the Ukrainian forces in Velikaya Novosilka has indeed closed, and probably the Ukrainian troops in Velikaya Novosilka do have the option of retreating, but that option is closing fast. In the Kurakovo area, things are far worse. Here, we're getting reports that the Russians have now entered the fortified village of Uspenska. This lies to the west of Sukhiyali, which the Russians captured a few days ago. That they have also advanced and are now in the process of storming the village of Dachny, which lies immediately to the west of Kurakovo. There are reports that Russian forces are advancing northward from Sukhiyali to Dachny as well, so that the Russian advance on Dachny is coming from two directions: from the north from Sonsivka and Stary Terny, and south from Sukhiyali. The gap between these two advancing Russian forces is said to be around 5 kilometers, which, of course, can already be covered by mortar and rocket fire and, of course, artillery fire as well. If the Russians link up between Dachny and Sukhiyali, then there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that all the Ukrainian forces south of Kurakovo and in Kurakovo itself will be caught in a trap. And the trap will be sealed. We'll be talking about a cauldron comparable to the one that the Ukrainian forces in Mariupol back in 2022 found themselves in. So anyway, this is the story so far of the battle in Kurakovo. Russian sources say that the Ukrainians understand that they're looking at a potential trap, that they're trying to withdraw their troops from Kurakovo specifically, that the forces that still occupy certain buildings in western Kurakovo are territorial defense troops, in other words, recently mobilized militia troops who are acting as a covering force as the main regular troops retreat. This has been a pattern, by the way, throughout the fighting. But there are reports that just as the 72nd Brigade of the Ukrainian army, one of Ukraine's best brigades, was effectively destroyed in the fighting for Ugleda, the 79th Brigade, which previously defended Novomikhailivka and various other villages, and which has also played a role in the defense of Kurakovo itself, that the elite 79th Brigade is about to be destroyed also. Two of Ukraine's best brigades, supposedly, have been destroyed or are in the process of being destroyed in the fighting, with Kurachovo itself about to be abandoned and therefore about to fall under Russian control. So all of this, very bad and very critical, but the situation around Pokrovsk is equally bad, because here it seems that the Russians have recently captured a village called Novotroitske that lies to the southwest of Pokrovsk. There are reports this morning that they have captured an even more, a bigger and more important village called Shevchenko, which lies immediately to the south of Pokrovsk. The Russians are also said to be advancing on another village called Pishanye, which lies to the northwest of Shevchenko itself, and which would bring the Russians very close to the main road leading into Pokrovsk from the west. There are reports that all the shops and other civilian facilities in Pokrovsk have closed and have been evacuated, and that proper defense lines in Pokrovsk do not exist, and that a Russian assault on Pokrovsk is about to begin, and that Pokrovsk cannot be defended and could quickly fall. So, a very disastrous situation. I've said many times that the fighting, bringing together Ugledar, Velikaya Novosilka, Kurachovo, Selidovo, and Pokrovsk itself, all form part of one great battle. It looks as if we're now reaching the end point of that battle. Selidovo, Kurachovo, Ugledar have already fallen. Velikaya Novosilka, likely to fall fairly soon. Pokrovsk itself, the biggest town in this area, the key point in this defense position, the key defensive position in this battle, it looks likely to fall too. So, a terrible situation for the Ukrainians there, but things look bad everywhere else as well. In Toretsk, the Ukrainians themselves apparently are now confirming that the entire territory of the central mine in the center of Toretsk, including the slag heaps and the industrial facilities, are under Russian control. The Russians captured the area of high-rise buildings in Toretsk. It seems that the only areas of Toretsk that the Russians still have to capture are now low-rise residential areas to the north. Many of them, I suspect, made largely wooden. It looks as if we are indeed now finally in the last days of the battle for Toretsk. The Ukrainians defended Toretsk as toughly as they could. But it's important to remember that it was widely assumed that this would be one of the most difficult parts of the Ukrainian defense lines for the Russians to break. It consisted of large numbers of industrial buildings, coal mines, slag heaps, factories, a fortified prison complex. The fighting in the Toretsk area began in May. The Russians have had to fight their way through. It's taken them several months. But all considered, compared to fighting, the intensity of the fighting that there's been in other places, Bakhmut, for example, the fighting for Toretsk has been significantly simpler than I think many people had anticipated. I've heard no news from Chasiv Yar or Kupiansk over the last 24 hours, but Group of Forces North are now saying that the fighting in Volchansk, in northern Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, has moved to the eastern part of the town, which also suggests that the high-rise building area in Volchansk is under Russian control. And more importantly, the Russians have now conclusively captured the village of Plekhovo, southwest of Sudzha in Kursk region. They seem to have pushed well beyond Sudzha, well beyond Plekhovo itself. They've crossed a small river that is located there, and they've also advanced into Sumy region itself and occupied positions to the south of Sudzha in Sumy region. And it's been suggested that all of these moves confirm that Group of Forces North, General Lapid's command, are engaging in a major encirclement operation of the Ukrainians, that they are aiming to cut the main road from Sumy to Sudzha, and in effect to create a cauldron in Kursk region where much of the best part of the Ukrainian army is now to be found. And Group of Forces North, in their very latest report, spoke of a catastrophic collapse of morale by the Ukrainian troops still fighting in Kursk region. Well, whether this big encirclement of the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region will take place, I cannot say. If it does happen, then I think it will be a terminal blow, and it will be, frankly, the moment of no return for Ukraine. Zelensky himself has become increasingly desperate sounding over the last couple of days. He says that he wants to telephone Biden to discuss accelerated membership of Ukraine into NATO. He's also apparently making various other calls to other European leaders. He's also again refusing to lower the mobilization age to 18. I suspect he's doing that because of the enormous difficulties that he realizes would arise if such a mobilization were to take place. Many of the 18-year-olds would probably disappear. There are not that many of them anyway. And besides, there would undoubtedly be strong opposition from the parents of many of these people. Anyway, for the moment, Zelensky is saying that what Ukraine needs is more weapons. It doesn't need more troops. There are still brigades that have been formed in the rear that could be committed to the battle. The problem is that they don't have the weapons because the West's promises of weapons supplies have never been fulfilled. Well, if we go back to what Naryshkin, the Russian intelligence chief, has said, he talked about what the Western powers, the European powers, might choose to do. He said that with Ukraine's defeat, military defeat, now just over the horizon, they will fight, the Western powers, and I'm quoting from him again, they will fight until the last Ukrainian, and once there are no Ukrainians left, the Baltic nations, the Eastern Europeans, and later the Germans will be forced to join the fight against the scary Russian bear. The globalist powers already have the technologies they need to brainwash common people and put pressure on local elites. But that a further escalation of that kind will not only fail to deplete Russia's resources, which is what Washington and London are aiming for, but will bring the West closer to its own defeat. Now, about 2 weeks ago, Naryshkin revealed a SVR report sent to the Kremlin, in which apparently Naryshkin said that, in which Naryshkin said the Kremlin had been advised that there are plans being hatched to send a force of 100,000 men from European countries, the European countries of NATO, to Ukraine to fight the Russians there, or rather to engage as peacekeepers there as part of some great peace plan supposedly negotiated with Donald Trump. By not Donald Trump. Though, as I have pointed out, a force of 100,000 men is not a force to maintain peace. It is clearly intended to be a fighting force to fight the Russians. So what Naryshkin is basically saying is that the Ukrainian army itself is now almost at the point of no return, that its collapse is very close, but the war will not end because the Western powers, Washington and London, plan to replace the Ukrainian troops with troops from the European members of NATO, the Baltic states, the East European states, and presumably after Friedrich Merz is elected Chancellor, troops from Germany as well. And Naryshkin says that the Russians are not worried or dismayed by this. If the European troops come, the Russians will continue to fight them and will defeat them. And that will simply compound the defeat that the Western powers, NATO, will have already suffered. Now, about the likelihood that the Ukrainian army itself might collapse at some point over the next few weeks and months, I think about that Naryshkin could very well be right. Over the last couple of days, over the last week in fact, I would say that there has been an acceleration, a further acceleration in the momentum of the Russian advance. I get no sense that the Ukrainians are able to hold the Russians back in any particular place, and there are lots of reports that the Russians are now planning to activate General Teplinsky's group of forces Dnieper, another 130,000 men who have been held back in reserve, that there is plans for some kind of amphibious operation across the Dnieper into Kherson itself, that there might also be plans by the Russians to advance beyond the Kakhovka, the former Kakhovka reservoir, to advance towards places like Nikopol and Kryvyi Rog, and also presumably eastwards through Orechov and Gulyapolye towards the great city of Zaporozhye. So perhaps Naryshkin is right that, as I said, Ukraine's own ability to sustain the war is reaching its final point of complete exhaustion. But about a Western plan to deploy Western troops to fight in Ukraine, well, here I think he's probably sincere in his belief. Why else would he say it? But I think that he probably underestimates the enormous political difficulties that any such plan in Europe would face. In Poland, Polish military officials, just before I made this program, have again categorically ruled out the commitment of Polish troops to fight in Ukraine. I don't think the Baltic states are in any position to continue the battle in Ukraine either. And to say it straightforwardly, if Friedrich Merz wants to send German troops to fight in Ukraine, then he clearly has a political death wish, because if he does any such thing, I don't think he will remain Chancellor of Germany for very long. I think German public opinion would solidly oppose this. And whatever one thinks of the extraordinary events that have taken place in Romania, where the entire first round of the elections has been annulled by decree of the Constitutional Court, I, for the record, am outraged by it. But that's my own view, and of course I'm not Romanian. But anyway, whatever one thinks of that, whatever one's view of the first round of the Romanian election, it is clear to me that the Romanian people do not want to be drawn into a war in Ukraine. So I think that Naryshkin is overstating significantly the prospect of escalation by the Western powers in Ukraine. In fact, I'm going to suggest that the opposite is true. I think that immediately after Donald Trump's election, there was feverish activity across the West by the Biden administration in European capitals to try to find some way to keep the Ukrainian war going after Donald Trump became president. So we had the decision to conduct missile strikes on Russian territory. We had the weapons packages. We had renewed talk about sending European troops to Ukraine. And then very quickly, reality broke through. The Russians made it clear that they had the means to conduct counter-escalations to the missile strikes. The Oreshnik was wheeled out, and the Russians showed what it could do. Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, telephoned General Brown and delivered his warning. The missile strikes on Russia, to a deafening silence across the West, have now ceased. The talk of sending European troops to Russia has gradually faded as Emmanuel Macron, its primary advocate, faces growing political difficulties. In fact, an outright crisis with cause for him to resign back home in France. And in Germany, the AfD and Sarah Wagenknecht's movements seem to be electorally in the ascendant, with Merz himself discovering that the most unpopular part of his political stance is the one in which he appears to show a willingness to engage the Russians in Ukraine. And it's also become increasingly clear that the Biden administration itself is out of cards to play. The attempt to surge support to Ukraine has foundered not on lack of money, but on lack of weapons. The last gigantic aid package seems to be more about ordering weapons for Ukraine in the far future, rather than delivering weapons to Ukraine now. And anyway, one way or the other, all the hopes, if one can call them that, about countering Trump and holding back the Russians and delaying the inevitable in Ukraine have now melted away, and a mood of resignation and even fatalism across the European capitals has taken its place. And of course, they've now had in Syria the perfect story to divert attention away from Ukraine. With the collapse of the Assad government, they can talk more and more about Syria. They can make entirely specious and even absurd parallels between Assad's position and that of Putin, speculating that just as Assad fell, Putin could fall in the same way. One of the most nonsensical claims I have ever seen, by the way. But anyway, they can now do that. They can cover the column inches and the newscasts talking about this new conflict. And they don't have to talk about Ukraine anymore. And I suspect that for them, that has become a relief. And it means that Syria, the crisis in Syria, if it serves no other end than to provide them with a new narrative that they can present in substitution of the old Ukraine narrative, well, for the moment at least, it's serving that particular purpose. All of this is utterly dismal. And Trump, of course, has been making statements about how he wants a ceasefire and peace. And General Kellogg has been appointed, and negotiations may occur. But again, to repeat once more, the most important thing for any American official, for General Kellogg and Fred Feitz and President Trump himself to recognize, is the mood of confidence that the Russians are projecting. Naryshkin, at least, and I'm sure he is articulating a widespread opinion inside the Kremlin, believes that the war is, to all intents and purposes, won. Now, one final thing. There have been many protests in Georgia ever since the election that took place there a couple of weeks ago. It's been barely reported, but it turns out that the ODYSEE monitors actually gave the election in Georgia a clean bill of health. So it does seem as if the election was properly conducted and is legitimate. The Georgian Prime Minister muddied things by giving the impression at one point that EU accession talks had been frozen until 2028, and this gave a further spur to the protests. He's tried to walk that back, by the way, but I don't myself think that anybody seriously believes that Georgia is going to join the EU anytime soon. But anyway, one way or the other, the Georgian Prime Minister is now saying that Georgia has successfully seen out the colour revolution attempt that had been launched against it, We are now just days away from the point where the Georgian president, who backs the protests and who has become, in some ways, I think, the most visible figure in the protests, is going to be legally required to stand down. No doubt she will resist doing that, but presumably there are ways to remove her from the building she currently occupies. Anyway, the Georgian Prime Minister says that the colour revolution attempt has been seen off. Now, that may be true. It may be that there are other events still to happen. It may be that the protesters still have some tricks up their sleeve, and that so do their sponsors. But I suspect that the Prime Minister is probably right, in which case the Georgian crisis is over. Georgia will indeed stabilise under its current government, which will have been given a renewed lease of life, and the European Union will have suffered another significant blow. So, anyway, that is the situation as I see it today. Syria, as I said, as far as I can see, continues its rapid descent into chaos. But in Ukraine, the Russians now are publicly saying that they sense that the war is almost won. Donald Trump is going to face a full in-tray when he becomes president in January. But if Syria, the part of the tray that concerns Syria, may be filled to overflowing, it may be that by the time he becomes president, the situation in Ukraine will have evolved to the point that there is little actually for him to do. Anyway, there we are. That's where I finish today's programme. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.